A horse is straining at a rope in a field outside Targovište, and on the other end of that rope is a man's leg. There's a second horse pulling the other leg in the opposite direction. Between them, held upright by two men, is a sharpened wooden stake that has been rounded at the tip and rubbed with oil so it won't go in too fast. They're lowering the prisoner onto it, slowly. The way you'd lower something you didn't want to break, because the entire point is that it be slow. A sharp point kills quickly. A blunt, greased one does not. It slides up through the body over hours, sometimes over days, missing the organs that would offer an early death. And the man stays alive the whole time, conscious, looking out over a field where hundreds of others are doing the same thing on stakes of their own. Some of them are higher than him. Height meant rank. The most important enemies were raised the highest, so that the field, seen from a distance, looked like a kind of terrible orchard, the bodies thinning toward the top where the great men hung against the sky. The prince who ordered this was, by most accounts, eating nearby, calmly. That image, a man at a table set among the dying, comes up again and again in the sources, and we'll get to how reliable those sources actually are, because that question matters more than almost anything else in his story. But the field is real, the method is real, and the man responsible kept doing it, in one form or another, for most of his adult life, right up until the end, and even, by some accounts, when there was nobody left to do it to but the mice in his prison cell. Welcome in. Glad you're here, and a real thank you to everyone who supports the channel. Do me a small favor while you're getting settled. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. Right. Let's go back to the start, to a stone house in a Saxon town and a baby born into a family that had just been handed a dragon. The town was Sighișoara in Transylvania, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary, and the year was somewhere around 1431. The house still stands. A 3-story stone building where the family lived from roughly 1431 to 1435, and you can go and visit it today, which is a genuinely odd thing to be able to say about the birthplace of a man like this. There's a little plaque. People take photos. His father was Vlad II, and in that same year, 1431, the father travelled to Nuremberg and knelt before Sigismund of Luxembourg, the Holy Roman Emperor, to be inducted into something called the Order of the Dragon. The order was a chivalric brotherhood, founded to defend Christianity against the advancing Ottoman Turks, and its members wore the badge of a dragon curled in on itself, often with a cross laid across its back. From that badge, Vlad II got the name people would use for him for the rest of his life, Dracula, the dragon, and his sons, by the plain logic of the language, became the sons of the dragon, Dracula, which is exactly where the name you already know comes from, Dracula, son of Dracula, son of the dragon. And when it began, that name carried no menace at all. It was an honor. It marked a family that had sworn an oath to fight for the cross against the largest empire on their horizon, and the dark flavor came later, partly because in the Romanian that developed, the word Drac slid toward meaning something closer to devil, and partly because of what the second son grew up to do with the name he'd inherited. A name that started as a knight's badge ended as a byword for terror, and the man in the middle of that transformation is the one we're here for. That second son is Vlad III. born into a borderland that I need to describe properly for a moment, because almost everything that happened to him grows directly out of where he was standing on the map. Wallachia was a small Orthodox principality, wedged like a nut in a cracker between two enormous powers. To the north sat the Catholic Kingdom of Hungary, ambitious and crusading. To the south, across the wide line of the Danube, lay the Ottoman Empire, which in this stretch of history was doing one thing above all others: expanding, swallowing kingdom after kingdom and turning toward Central Europe. Wallachia's rulers, called voivodes, were caught in a position that I'd call impossible if the word weren't too soft for it. They were expected to pay an annual tribute to the Ottoman sultan to keep the peace, money, and often a levy of young boys for the sultan's armies. And at the very same time, they were expected to ride out and fight alongside the Hungarians whenever the crusading mood swept through. You could not satisfy both. Lean too far toward the Turks and Hungary would move against you. Lean too far toward Hungary and the Sultan would send an army or simply replace you with someone more agreeable. On top of all that, the voivode wasn't even securely in charge of his own nobility. He was, in effect, elected by the boyars, the great land-owning families, who switched their loyalty from one prince to the next whenever it served them, and who assassinated rulers with a regularity that makes the whole century read like a casualty list. Reigns were short. Deaths were violent. Loyalty was a thing you rented by the season. So Vlad was born into instability that was almost architectural. It was built into the foundations of the place. His mother is usually identified as a Moldavian princess named Kneajna, a daughter of the ruling house of Moldavia, though the records on her are thin enough that careful historians hold that identification loosely and don't insist on it. He had an older brother, Mircea, born a few years ahead of him, who was the heir and the family's future. He had a younger brother, Radu, born around 1437 or so, who history would come to call Radu the Handsome. And hold on to Radu, because his life winds around Vlad's in a way that turns genuinely tragic before we're through. And there was a half-brother in the picture too, born to a different mother, a boy who'd grow up to be known as Vlad the Monk. A crowded, complicated family in a crowded, complicated little country that every larger power on its borders wanted to control or own outright. Consider what it actually meant to be a Wallachian prince in practical daily terms. You ruled a land with no natural fortress walls around it, open to the steppe and the river, crossed by trade roads that could just as easily carry an army. Your throne was a chair that the men beneath you could pull out from under you, and frequently did. The voivodes before Vlad came and went so fast that the boyars had learned to treat each new prince as a temporary inconvenience to be outlived rather than a master to be obeyed. A prince in Wallachia was a man standing on a frozen river in spring, listening for the ice to crack, knowing it would, the only question being when and how far he'd fall. Vlad's own father had ridden that ice and gone through it into a marsh. His brother had ridden it and ended up blind in a grave. Vlad grew up watching exactly how a Wallachian prince dies, and when his own turn came to stand on the ice, he decided the way to survive it was to terrify everyone around him so completely that no one would dare reach for the chair. It's a strategy with an obvious flaw, which we'll watch catch up with him, but you can see where it came from. He'd seen the alternative, and the alternative was being buried breathing. Now the childhood stops being anything like ordinary, and this is where the shape of the whole life gets set. In 1442, the Ottoman sultan, Murad II, summoned Vlad's father to a meeting. He suspected the Wallachian prince of leaning toward Hungary, of being unreliable, and he wanted that fixed. Vlad II went to the meeting, and he made the choice that I suspect he regretted to the end of his days. He brought his two younger sons with him, Vlad, who was around 11, and little Radu, younger still. The meeting turned out to be a trap, or near enough to one to make no difference. The father was detained, and the price of his release was the boys. They stayed behind. Hostages, living guarantees of their father's good behavior, held by a foreign empire whose language they did not speak, in a place a long way from anything they knew. They were taken deep into Anatolia, to a fortress, and held there for years. The conditions were stranger than a dungeon, and in their way, worse. They were not chained in a pit. They were educated, taught logic, the Quran, the Turkish language, horsemanship, the courtly arts of the Ottoman world. The Ottomans handled high-value hostages with a certain care, for the cold and obvious reason that a dead hostage is worthless as leverage. You don't damage the thing you're holding over a man's head, not unless he forces your hand. So the boys were kept well by the standards of the age. But comfort and safety are not the same thing, and the two brothers knew exactly how thin the thread was that held them above real harm. They had a living example to teach them. The sons of a Serbian ruler, held under almost identical circumstances as hostages, were blinded with red-hot irons when their father wavered and tried to slip free of his obligations. The boys would have known that story intimately. They lived inside the everyday possibility of it. Every day their father stayed loyal, they kept their eyes. Every day he didn't, they might not. That is a thing to grow up underneath. An 11-year-old learning to read the political weather of an empire because the wrong front could cost him his vision or his life. And the two of them came out of those years pointing in completely opposite directions, which is one of the saddest details in the entire account, and one I find hard to move past. Radu, the younger one, adapted. He learned to move gracefully through the Ottoman court. He formed a close bond with the Sultan's son, the future Mehmed II, the man who would one day conquer Constantinople, possibly a very close bond, a personal and intimate one, depending on which historian you read. He eventually converted to Islam and built a whole life and career inside the empire that had taken him captive. He found, somehow, a way to belong to the place that held him. Vlad went the other way entirely. Whatever those years did to him on the inside, and the records simply do not give us access to his thoughts, he came out hard, suspicious of everyone, carrying something that he would spend the rest of his life pouring back out onto other people in volumes that staggered everyone who witnessed it. Historians have reached for every modern frame to explain what those years made of him: trauma, post-traumatic stress, paranoid personality disorder, even the suggestion of sexual abuse during his captivity. None of it can be proven on a man 5 centuries dead, working from the accounts of people who hated him. But you don't need a diagnosis to see it. The boy who walked into that Anatolian fortress and the man who walked out of the whole experience were not the same creature, and the difference between them is written across everything that happened next. Consider for a moment what he would actually have seen and learned in those years, because the Ottoman court was no backwater, and the things it taught him stayed with him for life. The empire that held him was, at that point, one of the most sophisticated states on earth. Its administration, its army, its court ceremony, all running with a precision that the small fractured principalities to the north couldn't match. Vlad learned to read it. He learned the Turkish language well enough to pass for an officer in the dark, a skill he would later use to talk a fortress garrison into opening its own gates to him. He learned how the Ottoman army moved, supplied itself, made camp, gave its orders, knowledge he would turn directly against that army 2 decades later, when he knew better than almost any Christian commander alive exactly how to starve it, poison it, and panic it in the dark. And it's reasonable to think, though we can't prove the inside of his head, that he learned impalement there too. The practice was used in the Ottoman world and across the region. It wasn't his invention. What he brought to it was scale and theatre and a refusal to stop. The empire took 2 boys as a guarantee against their father's treachery, and without meaning to, trained one of them into the most effective enemy it would face on that frontier for a generation. The hostage became the weapon, and he was forged with Ottoman tools. And then there's Radu, the brother, whose path makes Vlad's own choices land harder by sitting right alongside them. The 2 boys were raised in the same court, under the same threat, with the same training. One came out devoted to the Ottoman world and rose within it. The other came out its lifelong enemy. Mehmed kept Radu close, and when Mehmed finally turned his army around at the field of stakes and went home, the man he left behind to take Wallachia from Vlad was Radu, the handsome brother raised at the Sultan's side, set against the Impaler brother for the throne their father had died holding. 2 boys handed over together as hostages, ending up on opposite ends of an Ottoman invasion, fighting over the same crown. The family that the boyars of Targovishte had tried to wipe out in 1447 finished the job of tearing itself apart from the inside. While Vlad and Radu were held in Anatolia, their family back in Wallachia was being torn apart, and I want to slow all the way down here, because this is the wound. This is the engine of everything that follows. If you understand nothing else about why this man became what he became, understand this part. In 1447, John Hunyadi, the powerful regent governor of Hungary, the dominant military figure of the region, decided that Vlad's father had become a liability and moved against him. The details of the father's death are grim and a little murky, the way these things often are when nobody friendly survives to write them down, but the outline is clear enough. Vlad II was hunted down and killed in the marshes near a place called Balteni, finished off in the reeds and the mud. That on its own would be a family tragedy, a father murdered in a swamp. But it's what happened to the eldest brother that turns family tragedy into the thing that hollowed out and reshaped Vlad's soul. Mircea, the heir, the eldest son, around 19. He was taken not by foreign enemies but by the boyars and the Saxon townsmen of Targovishte. the local men who'd decided the family was finished and wanted it made certain. They beat him. Then they heated iron rods in a fire until they glowed and pushed them into his eyes, burning the eyes out of his skull, cooking them in the sockets until there was nothing left to see with, and the boy was blind and screaming in the dark. He was still alive when they were done, still breathing, still feeling all of it, his ruined face leaking, when they carried him to a hole already dug and put him down into it and began shoveling the earth back in on top of him. He felt the dirt come down. Blind, he couldn't even watch it fill the light. There was no light left for him. He could only feel the weight of it land on his chest and his face and pack down around him until the breathing stopped. They buried Vlad's brother alive in the ground, 19 years old. His eyes burned out, clawing at soil he couldn't see. The order of it is the horror. The blinding first, then the grave. And when Vlad finally took the throne for real, the boyars of Targovishte, the same class of men, in some cases the same men, who had burned out his brother's eyes and shoveled dirt onto his living face, were first on his list. He never forgot it. The Easter feast, the field of stakes, the death march up the mountain. All of it runs back to a blind boy suffocating under the soil at Targovishte. All of that is the ground he grew out of. A hostage childhood spent balanced above a long drop, a father murdered in a marsh, a brother blinded and buried alive, and a name that meant dragon, about to come to mean something far worse than the men who gave it to his family ever intended. Let's get him onto the throne because he didn't reach it cleanly, and the mess of how he got there matters to who he became once he held it. His first reign came in 1448, and it was almost laughably brief. The Ottomans, who had been holding him all this time, worked out that he might be useful as their own puppet on the Wallachian throne. So when the sitting prince, Vladislav II, marched off to fight at the Second Battle of Kosovo, the Turks installed the teenage Vlad in the capital. He held it for about 2 months. Then the rightful claimant came back from the war, and Vlad had to run for his life. 2 months. That was his first taste of power, and it ended with a young man fleeing into exile to keep his head on his shoulders. He went first to Moldavia, then circled back toward Hungary, switching sides as survival demanded, biding his time and learning the brutal arithmetic of regional politics from the losing seat. He spent the better part of 8 years like this, landless, watching, building alliances with whoever could put him back on the throne, including, eventually, the very Hungarian faction tangled up in his own father's death. That's how the politics of survival worked in that world. You allied with your enemy's enemy, and when it served you, you allied with your enemy himself, and you swallowed whatever you had to swallow to stay in the game. Vlad swallowed a great deal in those 8 years. It does not seem to have made him gentler. In 1456, he made his real move. He invaded Wallachia, met Vladislav II on the outskirts of Targovishte, and by most accounts killed him in single combat, hand to hand, on the 22nd of July. And with that, the dragon's son was Prince of Wallachia for real this time. The reign everyone remembers, the one that filled the German pamphlets and the chronicles and eventually the horror shelves of every bookshop in Europe, ran from 1456 to 1462. 6 years. It is genuinely difficult to absorb how much horror he managed to compress into those 6 years. One of the first things he did, or very close to it, was settle accounts with the boyars. And the way he did it is one of the most famous stories attached to his name, so let's walk through it the way the oldest sources tell it, slowly, because the cruelty of it is in the details and the design. Around Easter, he invited the leading boyar families to a feast, the great old families. The ones who had grown rich and comfortable by switching their loyalty from prince to prince to prince, who had outlived ruler after ruler by always betraying the falling man in time to flatter the rising one. The ones, and this is the part he had carried in his chest for years, connected to the men who had put his brother screaming and blind into the earth. They came to the feast in their best clothes, because that is what you wear when a prince invites you to celebrate Easter. Silks, jewels, their finest. And at some point during the gathering, when the wine had gone round and the mood was easy, Vlad asked them a question. He asked them how many princes each of them had lived through. How many reigns? How many rulers had they personally seen come and go in their lifetimes? It sounds like idle dinner talk, the sort of question an old man at a feast would happily answer. It was a trap. Every senior boyar in that room had outlived a long line of princes, and in Wallachia you only outlived princes by betraying them in time. The honest answer to Vlad's question was a confession, and the proudest, most experienced men gave the largest numbers without seeing the floor open under them. The guards took them at the table. The old boyars, still in their Easter silk, still with wine in their mouths, were dragged out of the hall and put on stakes right there outside it. The feast still laid, the candles still burning, and the men who'd come to celebrate now lifted up on sharpened poles in their finest clothes, the jewels glinting on hands that twitched and grabbed at the wood as the points worked up into them. That was the first of his orchards. The party never properly ended. It just turned into a field of dying noblemen in party dress. The younger boyars, the strong ones, along with their wives and their children, got a different sentence, slower and worse. He marched them, on foot, in the same fine Easter clothes they'd worn to his table, roughly 50 miles north into the mountains, to the ruins of a fortress high in the Argesh Gorge, a place called Poenari. Up there he put them to work rebuilding it. They hauled brick and wet stone up a cliff face, fired the kilns, carried mortar on their backs up the bare rock under guard, from first light to dark, day after day after day. The oldest Romanian chronicle says their Easter finery wore down to rags and the rags wore off entirely, and they kept working naked on the mountainside. The noble women and their children stripped by the labor itself, skin torn open on the stone, hands worn to meat. They were not fed enough to live on. People dropped where they stood. Others lost their footing with a load on their backs and went over the edge into the gorge, and the work went on over the sound of them hitting the rocks below. The ones who lasted long enough finished his fortress for him. The rest were left where they fell on the slope, and in a few weeks he had wiped out the old nobility, the whole treacherous class that had murdered his father and buried his brother, and handed their lands to new men who owned nothing except what Vlad had given them and would lose it the instant they crossed him. It worked. He broke the boyars and took the throne out of their reach for good. And he did it by walking an aristocracy up a mountain in their Easter silks and working them to death against the rock, parents and children hauling stone until the clothes rotted off their backs and they dropped into the gorge or simply lay down and stopped. Vlad watched it happen and felt nothing anyone ever recorded. The Easter feast was the famous stroke, though it was only part of what he did to the men who governed Wallachia. The purge of the nobility ran broader and longer than a single banquet. He killed and dispossessed boyar families across his early reign, seizing their lands and handing them to lesser men, soldiers and minor figures who had nothing without him, and so could be relied on to fear losing it. He was, in his brutal way, restructuring the entire power base of the country, pulling wealth and authority out of the hands of old families and concentrating it on the throne. The German pamphlets, hostile as they are, preserve a sense of how total this could feel. Vlad burning, impaling and dispossessing until the men who had spent generations treating the prince as a piece they could move and remove found that the piece had started removing them. 5 reigns in living memory had taught the boyars that princes were temporary and they were permanent. Vlad set out, with stakes and fire, to teach them the opposite, and for 6 years he made it stick. A smaller story from this stretch comes down through the sources, and it shows the streak of grim theatre in him better than any body count can. 2 foreign visitors, in the common telling, papal envoys or merchants, the accounts vary, came before him, and as was their custom they kept their caps on, the way men did in some courts to the west. We'll get to a more famous version of the hat story in a moment with the Ottoman envoys, but this smaller one is its rehearsal, and it lands the same way. Vlad noticing a custom, a habit, a small assertion of how the wider world did things and deciding to answer it with iron. He had a particular sensitivity to anything that read as disrespect, and a particular gift for turning the disrespect back on the person who offered it, magnified into something they would not survive. Poenari, while we're here, is the castle with the genuine claim to being Dracula's castle, not the one the tourist brochures sell you. The brochures point at Bran Castle, which is dramatic and photogenic and perched on a cliff, and has, in historical fact, almost nothing to do with Vlad. He may have passed near it once. Poenari is the one his prisoners died building with their bare hands. It's mostly ruins now, reachable by a long, lung-burning climb up many hundreds of steps, and far fewer people make that climb than line up for the photogenic one. It is the realer place by a wide margin, and you can stand in it knowing what it cost to raise the walls around you. Let me get fully into the method now, the impalement itself, because I've used the word a dozen times and I want you to actually understand what it was, mechanically, in the body, before we go any further, since nearly everything else in this story runs straight through it, and the horror of the rest depends on you understanding this part properly. The stake was prepared with deliberate care, and the care was all directed at making death slower. It was not sharpened to a fine point. That was the mistake an amateur or a merciful man would make. A fine point pierces the heart, or a major vessel, or punches cleanly through something vital, and you die of shock and blood loss in minutes. That defeated the entire purpose. So Vlad's executioners rounded the tip of the stake, blunted it, and greased it with oil or animal fat so it would slide rather than tear. Then, in the method most commonly described, the stake was introduced into the body from below, through the rectum, or for women through the vagina, and the victim's own body weight, sometimes helped along by horses tied to each leg, pulling outward and downward, drew the body slowly down onto the wood. The blunt, greased point pushed up through the body slowly, sliding past the organs instead of bursting them, parting the soft inside of a person along the line of least resistance. It went up through the gut, up behind the stomach and the lungs, and came out, when it came out, through the chest, or the hollow of the throat, or a shoulder, or the open mouth, the tip wet and dark rising past the victim's own face. Nothing vital was torn on the way. That was the design. So the person lived and stayed awake, hanging from the wood that was slowly working its way up through the center of them, the weight of their own body driving it deeper by the hour. Some lasted a few hours. Many lasted 2 or 3 days. They hung there conscious, feeling the wood inside them, unable to lift themselves off it, soiling themselves, swelling, the thirst alone becoming its own torture under the sun. Men lasted longest. The stake found less to rupture in them, and they hung on, awake, for days. Women bled out faster. That was the only mercy the method offered anyone, and it wasn't offered on purpose. The stake was then raised upright and its base set firmly into the ground, and the person hung there, suspended in the air on the wood that ran through the length of them until they finally died, and usually well after, because the bodies were the point. They were a display, left up to be seen, and anyone who tried to take a body down to give it burial was themselves hanged for it. The height of the stake announced the importance of the victim. A field of these, and Vlad made several fields of these, had the great enemies raised high, and the ordinary ones lower, a whole hierarchy of agony you could read at a single glance from a distance, like a chart drawn in human beings. So that was the instrument. Now you know what it means physically when I tell you he impaled people. And now you'll understand, later, why the sight of a field full of them stopped an emperor in his tracks. And understand that the slowness was the point, not a side effect. Vlad could have killed quickly. Beheading, hanging, the sword, all of it was available, all of it faster and cleaner and just as final. He chose the stake precisely because it was none of those things. A man dying slowly on a stake in a public place did work that a quick death couldn't do. He was a message that stayed legible for days, a warning that didn't end with a single stroke, but went on broadcasting itself to everyone who passed, hour after hour, in sound as much as in sight. The fields of stakes weren't really about the people on them, who were already as good as dead the moment they were lifted. They were about everyone else. The boyars deciding whether to plot, the merchants deciding whether to cheat, the enemy soldiers deciding whether to advance. Vlad governed by turning human suffering into a standing advertisement. And the rounded, oiled, agonizing stake was simply the most efficient way he found to keep the advertisement running for as long as possible. The cruelty was a method, a horrifying one, but a method, with a cold purpose behind every choice that made it worse. With the boyars broken and Poenari rising on its cliff, Vlad turned to a longer war, and this one he waged against the Saxons. The Transylvanian Saxons were German-speaking merchants who ran the rich trading towns to the north. Brașov, which they called Kronstadt, and Sibiu, which they called Hermannstadt, were the two big ones. They had money, they had royal trade privileges, and they had a persistent, infuriating habit of sheltering rival claimants to Vlad's throne. Men who wanted his crown and were glad to use the wealthy Saxon towns as their base of operations. The Saxons also undercut Vlad's economy and flouted the trade rules he set. His response to all of it stretched across several years, from about 1457 to 1460, and it was savage even measured against the rest of his reign. In the spring of 1459, he came down on Brașov. He burned the suburbs, including the church of St. Bartholomew, and on a hill near the town, near the chapel of St. Jacob, he had a great many people impaled, men, women, children, Saxon merchants and ordinary townsfolk, and whoever else got swept up in it. The German pamphlets that later carried his reputation across Europe claim he impaled 600 people on that hill. A more careful modern reckoning, which I'll walk you through properly in a bit, suggests the real number for one of these specific incidents was 41 merchants, inflated roughly tenfold for effect. But whichever figure you take, the hill outside Brașov became a slope of stakes and slowly dying bodies, visible from the town, a message addressed to everyone who could see it. The quarrel with the Saxons had been building for a while before it boiled over into burning churches. They had backed his rivals, men like Dan, a claimant from the competing branch of the family, who used the wealthy towns as a launching pad to try for Vlad's throne. When Vlad caught Dan, the story goes, he made him dig his own grave and read his own funeral service before he was beheaded over it, which is the sort of detail that sounds embellished and may well be, but fits the pattern of a man who liked his executions to carry a lesson. The Saxons had also defied his trade rules, slipping goods through, ignoring the staple rights he tried to enforce, treating the Prince of Wallachia as an inconvenience to be worked around rather than a power to be obeyed. So he came for their commerce and their people together, burning the trading suburbs, impaling the merchants, torching the goods, making the cost of crossing him so visible and so permanent that the lesson would outlast any single season's trade dispute. The towns remembered. The pamphlets that did so much to blacken his name came in no small part from exactly these Saxon communities, the people who had watched him impale their relatives on the hill by the chapel, and who, once the printing presses arrived, had both the motive and the means to make sure all of Europe heard about it. Brașov gave Europe its single most famous image of the man, the one carved into woodcuts you've probably seen without knowing what they showed. A table set out in the open on the hill among the stakes. Vlad sitting at it, eating. Around him, hundreds of people dying on sharpened wood, some freshly raised and screaming, some hours in and past screaming, sagging on the shafts as their own weight dragged them lower. He ate his meal in the middle of it, bread, meat, wine, while the blood ran down the stakes into the dirt and the dying made the sounds that dying people make. The woodcut puts him at the table with a knife in his hand and a servant beside him hacking the limbs off a corpse on the ground, and the bodies on their poles filling the sky behind his head. One version of the story has a servant gagging at the smell, the reek of opened bowels and rot coming off the field, and Vlad answering by having the man impaled on a stake longer than all the rest. Lifted up high, the story goes, so he could be above the stench he'd complained about, choking to death over the whole field on the tallest pole on the hill. He finished his dinner. The woodcut was built to say one thing, and all of Europe believed it. Here was a man who could sit and chew and swallow with his appetite intact in the middle of a field of people he was killing by inches. The next year, 1460, he ran the same kind of campaign through Amlash and Fagarash, districts that had backed his rivals. He swept up whole villages, men, women and children together, the children no exception, and put the lot of them on stakes. A region emptied into a field of poles. Among the dead were hundreds of young foreigners who'd come into his lands to learn the language, herded into a building that was then locked and burned with all of them inside, the doors held shut against the people throwing themselves at them while the roof came down. The accounts from here run thick with specifics. People impaled in rows, mothers on stakes with their nursing babies impaled on the same shaft beneath them or pinned to their chests, victims skinned alive and left red and screaming, people lowered into boiling water, bodies hacked apart at the joints like meat on a block. Somebody wrote every one of these down, carefully, by candlelight, because each one was meant to travel and to make the person hearing it afraid. A few of these stories need telling on their own. The feast for the poor turns up in the German and Russian accounts both. Vlad gathered the sick, the old, the crippled, the beggars, the poor of his whole realm, and brought them into a great hall for a feast. Real food, more than most of them had seen in a lifetime, wine, warmth, the prince himself playing host to the wretched of his country. He let them eat until they were full. Then he stood and asked whether they would like to be free of all want forever, never to feel hunger or cold or pain again. They said yes. Every one of them said yes. He walked out, had the doors barred and the windows shut from the outside, and set the hall on fire with all of them sealed inside. They burned alive in a locked room with their stomachs full, clawing at boarded doors while the smoke took them. Hundreds of the helpless and the sick screaming inside a building their host had set alight. His explanation after was that he'd done exactly what he promised, freed them from all suffering, and cleared the country of its poor in one evening, the way you'd clear a field of weeds. A great cauldron shows up in the pamphlets as one of his methods, an enormous pot with a lid cut full of holes. People were lowered in, their heads pushed up through the holes so they couldn't sink and drown, and then the water under them was lit and brought slowly to a boil. They cooked alive from the neck down, their heads sticking out of the lid, screaming, while the water came up to a rolling boil around bodies that were still alive in it. And Vlad, or whoever he wanted to watch, stood by and watched the skin go. Other accounts have noses and ears and lips sliced off, hands and feet struck away, genitals cut out, people flayed alive and their skins hung up in the marketplace like washing, and the woman with the badly made shirt. The story goes that Vlad noticed a peasant's shirt was too short and poorly sewn, found out the man's wife had made it, and had the woman impaled for it, for a badly stitched shirt. Then he had the man given a new wife and warned her what happened to the last one. A bad seam and a stake in the same breath, no difference in his court between a traitor and a careless needle. Now I have to introduce a story that gets a little tangled in the retelling, because two separate incidents sometimes get fused together in popular accounts. But the core of it is one of the cleanest windows we have into how the man's mind actually worked. The envoys and their hats. Diplomatic envoys came to his court. In the most told version, they were Ottoman envoys, and there's a closely related telling involving other foreign representatives, but the shape is the same either way. They came into his presence, and they did not remove their headwear. Their turbans, in the Ottoman case, stayed firmly on their heads. When Vlad asked them why they had not uncovered their heads before a prince, as courtesy would demand, they explained, politely, reasonably, that it was their custom. Keeping the head covered was their religious and cultural practice, and they intended no insult by it whatsoever. It was simply how they did things, and a custom they were proud to keep. Vlad told them he understood completely. He said he wanted to help them keep their custom, to make absolutely sure they'd never have to take their hats off again, ever. Then he had them held down and their turbans nailed to their heads. Short iron nails set against the cloth on the crown of the skull and hammered down through the fabric, through the scalp, into the bone, 3 or 4 to a man, fixing the cloth to the head with blood running down into their eyes and beards while they were held still for it. The turbans never came off after that. The Russian account keeps something near his actual words. He was strengthening their custom for them, and they could go tell their master to stop sending his customs to princes who hadn't asked for them. Then he sent them back like that, nailed, to make the point in person. The cruelty there has a logic to it, a horrible internal logic, almost a courtroom's logic. You value this thing? You insist on keeping it on your head out of principle. Very well, I'll make sure you keep it on your head forever. That precise mechanism, punishing people with the exact thing they claim to care about, turning their stated principle into the instrument of their suffering, runs through a startling amount of what he did, and it's part of why some of his contemporaries came away calling him not just cruel, but clever. Wickedly, methodically clever. The story works on more than one level too, and that range is probably why it survived in so many versions across so many hostile and admiring sources alike. On the surface, it's a piece of horror, nails through skulls. Underneath, it's a message, and the message was aimed past the dead envoys at the sultan who'd sent them. Vlad was telling Mehmed, in the most permanent ink available, that he would not be talked down to, would not receive demands dressed up as diplomacy, would not play the obedient tributary prince his father had been forced to play. It was a declaration of war written on 2 men's heads. And the envoys, whatever they'd actually done or not done with their turbans, were the paper he wrote it on. He had a way of turning people into messages, of using a human body to say a thing to someone who wasn't even in the room, and the nailed hats are one of the clearest examples of that gift, if you can call it a gift, working at full strength. By 1461, the impossible balancing act that every Wallachian prince had to perform finally gave way under Vlad, and it gave way toward open war with the Ottoman Empire. He had stopped paying the tribute. He had withheld the annual payment and, just as provocatively, He had refused to send the levy of young boys the Ottomans demanded for their armies, the same kind of tribute of children that had once put him and Radu in Murad's hands. The Sultan was now Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, which had fallen to him in 1453, the single most powerful ruler in that whole part of the world. And, in a detail that gives the coming war a strange personal undertow, the boyhood companion and intimate of Vlad's own younger brother Radu, who was at Mehmed's side. Mehmed was not going to let a small prince's defiance stand, not from a man whose brother served in his own household. Mehmed sent an envoy and a plan. The plan was to lure Vlad to a meeting at the Danube fortress of Giurgiu and capture him there, the same kind of trap, more or less, that had once caught his father and cost Vlad and Radu their freedom as boys. Vlad saw straight through it, and his answer was the opening move of a military campaign that, for sheer cold audacity, is honestly hard to believe even with the sources sitting in front of you. He took the two Ottoman officials sent to spring the trap, a commander named Hamza Bey and a Greek scribe named Thomas Katabalinos. Before he killed them, he had their arms and legs hacked off, the men cut down to limbless trunks, still breathing, and then he put them on stakes anyway, the bleeding stumps and all, Hamza Bey raised on the tallest pole, because rank was rank even here. Then Vlad rode to the gates of the fortress of Giurgiu and called up to the guards in fluent Turkish, the language the empire had spent his childhood teaching him, aimed now back at the men who'd taught it, passing himself off as an Ottoman officer until they unbarred the gate and let him in. He killed everyone inside. The whole garrison, put to the sword in their own fort, the empire's own language used to open the door to it. The trick at Giurgiu shows you the whole man in one move. The Ottomans had spent years teaching a hostage boy their language, their court, their ways, expecting to make him a useful, pliable client prince. Instead, he listened, remembered everything, and waited 20 years to use it to talk a garrison of their own soldiers into unbarring their gate so he could come in and kill them. Every gift the empire gave him, he repurposed into a blade aimed back at the giver. The language for the gate at Giurgiu, the knowledge of their camp for the night attack, the understanding of how their army marched and fed itself for the scorched earth campaign that nearly destroyed it. There's something almost surgical about how thoroughly he turned his education against his educators, and it makes the hostage years read, in hindsight, less like a tragedy that broke him and more like a school that armed him. Mehmed had inherited the consequences of his own father's decision to take those two boys captive, and at Giurgiu he started paying for it. Then, in the deep cold of the winter of 1461 into 1462, he crossed the frozen Danube into Ottoman Bulgaria and tore through it. Town by town, district by district, a campaign of deliberate devastation south of the river. He moved fast along the southern bank, hitting settlement after settlement, and the goal was not to hold territory. He couldn't have held it, but to bleed the Ottoman frontier, to kill as many people and burn as many places as possible, and then be gone before a real army could form against him. It was raiding raised to the level of a massacre. The whole stretch of the river turned into a killing ground over a few brutal weeks of winter, while the ice held and the Ottoman response was still gathering itself on the far side of the cold. Afterward, he sat down and wrote to Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, to report what he'd done, and the letter survives. He counted the dead by village, like a ledger. He'd killed 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians, he wrote, and that figure, he noted, left out the ones burned alive inside their own houses, whole families sealed in and torched along the river, and left out the ones whose heads his men had taken without bothering to report the number. To prove the count, his soldiers went through the dead and the not yet dead with knives and cut the noses off their faces. Off corpses. Off the wounded who were still moving. Sacks of human noses and ears, salted or not, hauled north to Buda so a king could tip them out and tally a massacre by the pile of severed faces on his floor. Vlad wrote the number down to the last digit, 23,884, the way a merchant records a shipment, and seems to have been proud of it. I should be honest that even this letter has its problems and its wrinkles. 2 copies survive, and the grand total Vlad gives, that 23,000 figure, doesn't actually match the sum of the individual local numbers he lists, which adds up closer to 20,000. Medieval arithmetic, or medieval exaggeration, or simply a copyist's slip somewhere along the centuries. We can't pin down which. But the order of magnitude survives, and so does the spirit of the thing, the meticulous counting of severed body parts to confirm a slaughter, the man's clear pride in the size of the number. That comes through with no ambiguity at all. Mehmed's answer was to invade in person in June of 1462, with an army the sources put at 150,000 men, though sober, modern estimates bring that down to perhaps 60,000 regular troops, plus a swarm of irregulars and camp followers. Against that, Vlad could field maybe 22 to 30,000. He could not win a straight, pitched battle against those numbers, and he was clear-eyed enough to know it. So he fought the way a man fights when he cannot afford to meet you head-on, and his methods turned the entire Wallachian countryside into a weapon aimed at the army marching through it. He burned his own land ahead of the advancing Turks. Crops torched in the fields, villages emptied and put to the torch, nothing left to forage, not a sack of grain, not a chicken in a yard. He poisoned the wells the army would have to drink from. He dammed and diverted streams to turn solid ground into marsh that swallowed horses to the belly and stuck the heavy wagons fast. And then he reached for something worse. He went through his own country and gathered the sick, men and women rotting with plague, with leprosy, the wasting and the coughing ones dying of tuberculosis, dressed some of them in Ottoman clothes, and sent them walking into the Turkish camp to mix with the soldiers and breathe on them and bleed on them and die among them. He was seeding an enemy army with plague, using living people as the carriers, sending the dying in to make more dying. The ones he sent were his own subjects, Wallachians, men and women already doomed, spent into the enemy camp like a handful of poisoned arrows. Inside a few days, the camp had thirst, no food, marsh underfoot, and now disease moving tent to tent in the dark. The Ottoman secretary Tursun Beg was actually on that campaign, marching with the army, and he left a description of what the men endured that's vivid in a way that makes you feel the heat lifting off the page. He wrote that the soldiers at the front of the column reported there wasn't a single drop of water to be found anywhere to ease their thirst. And he wrote that the sun beating down was so brutal that you could have cooked kebabs on the chainmail the warriors wore on their backs. Sit with that picture for a second. An army of tens of thousands dragging itself through a deliberately ruined and poisoned landscape. No clean water, no food in the burnt fields, the metal of their own armor hot enough to sear meat, and disease creeping silently through the camp at night. Vlad was bleeding that army before he ever properly met it in the field. He was killing it with the land itself. And then, on the night of the 16th into the 17th of June, 1462, he did the thing that lifted him, in some eyes at least, from a butcher into something more like a dark legend. The night attack. He took a force of cavalry, and under the cover of full darkness, he rode straight into the heart of the Ottoman camp with one single audacious goal: to find Mehmed's tent and kill the Sultan himself, to end the entire invasion with one blade in the dark. His men came in fast and silent, and then all at once loud, riding into the sleeping camp with torches and swords, slashing tent ropes so the canvas collapsed onto the men underneath, and then spearing them through it as they thrashed to get out. They cut down soldiers half asleep, trampled men under the horses, set tents burning with the sleepers still inside, and drove toward the cluster of grand pavilions at the center. But they hit the wrong ones. In the dark and the screaming and the smoke, Vlad's riders fell on the tents of two of Mehmed's viziers instead of the Sultan's own, and killed everyone in them, certain for a few minutes that they'd taken the head off the empire. The assassination missed by the width of a few tents. Thousands died in the panic before dawn, crushed, burned, run down, cut apart in the dark by their own side as much as by Vlad's. But Mehmed himself slept 100 yards from the slaughter and lived. By first light, Vlad had pulled his cavalry back out into the trees and was gone, leaving a camp full of dead men and a sultan who'd come a few tent lengths from ending up on a stake. The plan behind that raid was sound, part of why it nearly worked, and part of why it's remembered as more than recklessness. Vlad's spies and his own knowledge of how an Ottoman camp was laid out let him strike where the command would be. The accounts say he'd hoped a second Wallachian force would attack from another direction at the same moment to multiply the panic, and that the second attack didn't come or came too weakly, which is part of why a near miss stayed a near miss. An Ottoman camp at night was an ocean of identical tents in the dark, and finding one specific man inside it by torchlight while being attacked is the kind of thing that almost never succeeds. He got closer than almost anyone had a right to. Mehmed, by the accounts, was shaken badly enough that his own men had to steady the camp. And the Sultan's prestige took a real bruise from having a small enemy ride into his tents and nearly gut him in his sleep. But nearly is the whole tragedy of that night for Vlad. A few tents to the left, and the entire history of southeastern Europe bends in a different direction. As it was, the sun came up. Mehmed was alive, and the war went on toward the field of stakes. The Sultan, shaken but alive, kept advancing toward the Wallachian capital of Targovishte. And it was just outside that city that he came upon the thing this entire video has been circling back toward, the display that even the conqueror of Constantinople, a man not remotely squeamish about death, could not bring himself to stomach. A field. The Byzantine historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles, writing not long after, laid out the size of it like a surveyor measuring a plot. 17 stades long, 7 wide, call it 2 miles by something near a mile. And that whole expanse was stakes. Around 20,000 of them by his count, every one carrying a body. Men, women, children, Turkish prisoners Vlad had taken, and whoever else had been swept up. They'd been standing in that field long enough for the weather and the birds to do their work. The bodies had gone the colors that bodies go, bloated and split and blackening, the closer ones still recognizable as people, and the older ones collapsing into themselves on the poles. Chalkokondyles describes infants impaled and fixed to their mothers, the small bodies pinned to the women who'd carried them. And he writes it flatly, which is the worst part, that birds had built their nests inside the opened chests and bellies of the dead. Birds going in and out of the rib cages, raising chicks in the cavity where a man's lungs had been. 2 miles of that in the June heat, the smell of it rolling out across the country ahead of anyone who came near. And here is the moment that I think tells you more than any pamphlet could ever manage. Mehmed II, the man who had taken Constantinople, who had broken the last walls of the Roman Empire, who had seen war at its absolute worst and ordered plenty of it himself, a hardened, brilliant, utterly ruthless conqueror, looked at that field and stopped. Chalkokondyles writes that the Sultan was seized with amazement, with something close to awe, and that he said it was not possible to take the country away from a man who could do such things, a man who possessed such a diabolical command of how to wield terror over his realm and his own people. The most powerful ruler in that entire part of the world looked at what Vlad had built out of 20,000 human bodies and effectively conceded the argument. He turned the bulk of his army around and marched it home. The forest of the impaled accomplished what tens of thousands of additional soldiers could not have. It won in its way, simply by being too horrible to walk past. Mehmed left Radu behind, with a force to fight for the throne, and went home himself. Let me be clear about how the 1462 campaign actually ended, because the field of stakes is the dramatic image, though the withdrawal didn't settle things. Mehmed withdrew, yes, but he left Radu behind, and Radu had something Vlad had spent 6 years destroying. He had the goodwill of the boyars. The surviving nobility, the ones Vlad hadn't impaled or worked to death on the cliff at Poenari, looked at the handsome Ottoman-raised brother offering them peace and stability, and a prince who wouldn't burn them at his Easter table, and a great many of them went over to him. Vlad won the war against the army and lost the country to his own brother in the aftermath, because terror that turns back an empire is the same terror that leaves you with no friends when the empire is gone. He had no nobility left who loved him, because he'd made loving him impossible, and a prince with no nobles and a victorious enemy brother is a prince running out of ground to stand on. He fled north to Hungary looking for help and walked into a prison cell instead. The numbers need a quick caveat, because I keep throwing 20,000 and 23,000 at you, and the truth is leaner than that. A 2025 study in the Transactions of the Royal Historical Society went back through the records and found that maybe 7 to 10% of the claimed impalements hold up. So the field outside Targovište was probably closer to 16 or 1700 stakes than 20,000. Which is still 1,600 human beings rotting upright in a field 1.5 miles deep, birds in their open chests, the smell carrying for miles on a June wind. The pamphlet arithmetic was inflated. The stakes were not invented. 1,600 people died slowly on sharpened wood outside a single town, and that was one afternoon's work in one place in a 6-year reign. The estimates of his total kill count over his whole reign run all over the map, and the spread itself tells you how little anyone really knew. Vlad's own letter claims nearly 24,000 from a single winter campaign. A papal figure named Nicholas of Modrush, writing in the 1460s, put it around 40,000. A bishop named Gabriele Rangoni, in 1476, reached for 100,000. Popular sources today often settle on a round figure of roughly 80,000 for his entire reign. The truth is that nobody counted. The people who gave numbers had reasons to make them large or small, and the real total is unrecoverable. What we can say with confidence is that it was enough to horrify a man who had personally sacked Constantinople, and that's a sentence that doesn't need a precise number to do its work. Let's talk about that propaganda for a moment, because the question of who was telling these stories and why they were telling them is one of the genuinely fascinating things about this whole subject. And it changes how you hold absolutely everything else. The machinery that spread his reputation matters as much as the deeds it described, because without it, Vlad would likely be a regional footnote, one more brutal 15th century warlord among many, remembered locally and forgotten widely. The stories that made Vlad infamous across Europe came, in very large part, from printed pamphlets in German, produced in the lands of the Holy Roman Empire in the decades right around and after his death. And here's the context that makes this remarkable. This is the very dawn of the printing press. Gutenberg's revolution was brand new, the technology fresh and spreading fast. And among the very first things this world-changing new technology was used for, right alongside Bibles and church documents, were what we would now recognize without hesitation as horror bestsellers. The Vlad pamphlets were exactly that, some of the earliest of their kind. Printed in Nuremberg, in Bamberg, in Leipzig, Augsburg, Strasbourg, Lübeck. Edition after edition after edition, with lurid titles, and, before long, those woodcut illustrations of the man dining among his steaks. They gathered together dozens of his atrocity stories, the more graphic and stomach-churning the better, and people bought them in numbers. Vlad was, in a very real and literal sense, one of the first mass media monsters in human history, his reputation manufactured, packaged and sold by a brand new industry that had figured out almost immediately, within years of its own invention, that horror sells and sells well. And these pamphlets had motives, sharp, specific, traceable motives. The Saxon merchants whose towns Vlad had burned and whose people he had impaled on the hill outside Brasov were not exactly neutral parties to his story. They had every reason in the world to paint him as a devil in human form, and the means now to do it at scale. And sitting on top of that commercial grievance was a second, larger political motive. After the campaign of 1462, Vlad fled north to Hungary, fully expecting King Matthias Corvinus to help him keep fighting the Turks, to fund and back the war. Instead, Corvinus arrested him and threw him into prison, and held him there for years. The trouble was that Corvinus had taken crusade money, substantial funds raised across Christian Europe, blessed and encouraged by the Pope, gathered specifically to finance a war against the Ottomans, and rather than spending it on the campaign it was meant for, he had quietly kept it and locked up the one prince who had actually been out there fighting the Turks with everything he had. That was, to put it mildly, awkward for Corvinus. He needed a justification, and a strong one, for both the Pope and the powers of Europe who had handed over that money expecting a crusade. So his court produced letters, supposedly written by Vlad, showing that the prince had been secretly planning to betray Christendom and defect to the Sultan's side. Letters that most historians today regard as outright forgeries. And the broader smear campaign, the pamphlets and the horror stories pouring off the new presses, served exactly the same function from a different angle. The worse Vlad looked, the more monstrous and unhinged and beyond redemption, the more reasonable it appeared that Corvinus had been right to lock him away rather than fund him. Corvinus's own court historian later admitted, with some discomfort, that the real reason for the imprisonment was never actually made clear to anyone. The monster needed to be a monster, because a monster doesn't need a trial. So the legend was built by his economic enemies and his political jailer, sold on the new presses at the exact moment printing discovered that cruelty made money. None of which means the stories are false. The German printers exaggerated the counts and sharpened the framing, but the events behind them turn up in Ottoman, Byzantine and Russian sources too, written by people who never saw a Saxon pamphlet and had no reason to flatter Corvinus. He did these things. The men who wrote them down wanted you sick to your stomach over them, and they padded the numbers to get you there. But the stakes, the burnings, the field, the noses in sacks, those were real, and you'd have smelled them from a mile off. Other sources sit beyond the German presses, and they don't all agree with each other, and that disagreement is exactly what makes the whole picture so much richer than a simple monster story. A German poet named Michael Beheim composed a long poem about Vlad, more than 1,000 lines of it, and performed it at the imperial court in the winter of 1463, set to the melody of an Easter song. And I have a hard time getting past that particular detail. These atrocities, the impalings and the burnings, sung aloud to a hymn tune as courtly entertainment for the amusement of an emperor and his guests over the winter. Beheim drew his material from a Catholic monk who had fled Wallachia, so the source is hostile too, and Beheim calls Vlad a Wütrich, a bloodthirsty monster, a word he reserved for the very worst. The same word he used for Mehmed II himself, and for the Antichrist, ranking Vlad alongside Herod and Nero in the gallery of history's tyrants. One story in Beheim's telling has a monk standing before Vlad and telling him to his face that he is a wicked tyrant, bound straight for hell, and being impaled for it on the spot, for the honesty And here I have to correct one of the single most repeated facts about Vlad, because it is wrong, and you have almost certainly heard it somewhere. The claim that he dipped his bread in the blood of his victims and ate it. You've seen it everywhere, documentaries, articles, the backs of novels. It is a mistranslation, plain and simple. The original German text of Boehme's poem says that it pleased Vlad to see human blood flow, and that he washed his hands in it. Washed his hands. The German word in the poem is Hände, hands. Somewhere along the line, in a popular book about Dracula from the late 20th century, that word got rendered as bread, and the unforgettable image of Vlad sopping up blood with his dinner roll was born, and then spread absolutely everywhere precisely because it was so vivid and so awful and so easy to repeat. Scholars caught and corrected the error back in 2003. So when you see the blood and bread story presented as a genuine 15th century account, what you're actually looking at is a translation slip from the 1980s that took on a monstrous life of its own. By the hostile account, he washed his hands in blood. He did not, in any source we actually have, dip his bread in it. The truth is grim enough without the embellishment, which is something you could say about a lot of this man's afterlife. Then there are the Ottoman and Byzantine writers, Chalcondyles, who gave us the field and Mehmed's reaction, Tursun Beg, who gave us the kebabs cooking on the armor, the Serbian Janissary Konstantin Mihailovic, who recorded the capture of Hamza Bey and the grim business of the severed noses being collected. These men were Vlad's enemies on the battlefield, no friends of his at all, but they were not connected to the German propaganda machine, had no link to Corvinus or the Saxon printers, and they broadly confirm the major events even while they differ on the precise scale. When your enemies on 2 or 3 completely separate fronts, writing in different languages for different audiences, tell roughly the same story about you, that story carries real weight. The independence of the witnesses is what saves the core of this from being dismissed as mere propaganda. The events happened, the numbers grew in the telling, and then there's the strangest source of all, the one that turns the whole moral picture inside out, and it comes, of all places, from Russia. A narrative called the Skazania, the tale of Dracula the Voivode, written around 1486, probably by a Russian diplomat who had spent time in the region and gathered the stories firsthand. It tells many of the very same horrific events, the impalements, the burnings, the nailed hats, the death by stake for small offences. But the moral framing of it is something else entirely. In the Russian telling, Vlad is cruel, yes, undeniably, but he is cruel in the service of justice and order. He's a stern, terrifying, almost awe-inspiring ruler who makes his land safe and clean and orderly through the sheer total weight of fear, and the writer half admires him for it, can't quite condemn him. They even have a word for the quality they see in him, zlomudry, evil-wise, wickedly, formidably clever. A man whose wickedness was a kind of intelligence. The Skazania's signature story is the one about the golden cup. Vlad, the tale says, had a beautiful golden cup made and placed beside a public fountain in his realm, out in the open, free for any traveller or citizen to use to drink from, and he simply left it there, and no one stole it. For as long as Vlad ruled that land, the gold cup sat by the fountain in plain view day after day, year after year, completely untouched, because the fear of what Vlad would do to a thief was so total, so absolute, so universally believed, that not one single person in the entire country would dare to so much as pick it up with the wrong intention. He had made theft, in effect, extinct, not through justice in any gentle sense, but through pure terror so saturating that it changed how people behaved when no one was watching. And the Russians told that story not as an indictment, but as something close to a compliment, a marvel, an example of what fear could build. Another of the Russian stories has a foreign merchant whose money is stolen in the night while he's a guest in Vlad's capital. The merchant complains to the prince. Vlad has the whole city searched, finds and impales the thief without delay, and quietly has the stolen gold returned to the merchant, but he adds one extra coin to the pile when it's given back. The merchant, counting his money to check it, notices the extra coin and honestly reports back that he's been given one too many, that there's a coin here that isn't his. And Vlad tells him that if he had kept quiet about that extra coin, if he had pocketed it and said nothing, he would have been impaled on a stake right alongside the thief. The honesty test. Pass it and live. Fail it by a single coin and join the dying. The Russians found that admirable, an illustration of a ruler whose justice cut in every direction and spared no one, not even the man he'd been robbed. A coin's difference between a reward and a stake. The Skazani has a story about two monks that turns the same coin over again. Vlad, the tale goes, brought two visiting monks before his fields of the impaled and asked each of them what they thought of what he had done. One monk told him the truth as he saw it, that this was the work of a tyrant, that the prince had damned himself, that God would judge him for the cruelty. The other monk flattered him, told him these people surely deserved their fate, that a prince is appointed by God to punish evildoers, that Vlad had done right. In one version of the story, Vlad rewards the honest monk for his courage and impales the flatterer for his lie. In another version he does the opposite, impaling the monk who dared to condemn him and sparing the one who praised him. The fact that the story survives in both forms, with the reward and the punishment swapped, is almost the most revealing thing about it. Even the people telling Vlad's stories couldn't agree on whether he was the kind of man who killed you for honesty or killed you for flattery, because both felt true to the figure they were describing. He was unpredictable in a way that made every interaction with him a coin flip with a stake on the losing side. Women came in for their own particular horrors in these accounts. The Skazania and the German stories both describe what Vlad did to women he judged unchaste, adulterers, or widows he decided had been loose, or girls who'd lost their virginity before marriage. Their genitals were cut out, breasts were sliced off and left on display. In the worst of the descriptions, a woman would be skinned in that area, and the flayed skin hung up in the village square for everyone to see. The woman herself sometimes staked beside it, or a red-hot iron driven up through her, so it came out at the mouth. A lazy wife who let her house go could be killed for it the same as a thief. A husband whose shirt was too short, a beggar taking up room, a wife who burned the bread, a boyar who'd sold out 5 princes, all of it fed the same stakes, sorted only by how high each body was raised. The Russians told these stories as proof of order, a land scrubbed so clean of laziness and lies that a gold cup could sit unguarded by a road. The Saxons told them as proof he was a devil walking, one ruler, one set of corpses, and two peoples who came away unable to agree on whether they'd been looking at a monster or a model king. In Romania itself, the memory went a third way again, and it's the way that survives most strongly there to this day. In Romania, Vlad is remembered largely as a national hero, a prince who imposed hard order on a chaotic, corrupt, treacherous land, a man who broke the back of a self-serving nobility that had murdered his family and would have murdered him, a ruler who stood up to the Ottoman Empire, who told the most powerful state in the world that it would receive no more tribute and no more sons, at a time when much of the rest of Christendom was quietly paying the Sultan off and looking away. Even the Pope's own circle praised his anti-Ottoman campaigns while they were happening, before the politics shifted and the pamphlets took over the narrative. The very same field of stakes that horrified Mehmed and seized him with amazement was, to a Wallachian, the moment a tiny country made the largest empire in the world turn its army around and go home. One man's evidence of madness is another man's monument to defiance. So depending entirely on where you happen to be standing, a Saxon merchant who'd lost family and trade, an Ottoman soldier dying of thirst in a poisoned land, a Russian diplomat dreaming of strong rule, a Wallachian peasant who could finally leave a gold cup unguarded, Vlad was a demon, a worthy and terrifying enemy, an evil-wise dispenser of harsh and perfect justice, or a national savior. All of those judgments came out of the same set of events. None of that means the cruelty wasn't real, because the cruelty was extraordinarily, exhaustively real. It means that completely insane, the phrase sitting in the title of this video, is one interpretation among several that intelligent, informed contemporary people genuinely drew from watching this man rule. The people closest to him in time could not agree on whether he was a lunatic or a hero, and 5 centuries later, neither can we. Let me get back to the thread of his actual life, because I left him fleeing north to Hungary in 1462 and getting arrested by the king he'd come to for help, and his story is far from over at that point. The imprisonment lasted years, from roughly 1463 to 1475, much of it spent at the fortress of Visegrad on the Danube, north of Buda. Now, imprisonment for a deposed prince in that era did not necessarily mean a stone cell and chains. He was a high-status captive, a man with value, and over time his conditions seem to have eased considerably, his confinement loosening into something more like supervised residence. He was eventually allowed to marry, and his wife was Justina Szilágyi, a cousin of King Matthias Corvinus himself, which tells you that Vlad was being kept on a shelf for possible future use rather than simply being left to rot and die forgotten. You don't marry your captive into your own family unless you think you might need him again someday. He also converted during this period from Orthodox to Roman Catholic Christianity, a move the Russian Skazani treats as a genuine spiritual betrayal, an abandonment of the true faith, and which the Russian source even blames in its own theology for his eventual downfall and death. He and Justina had a son who would grow up to take the Wallachian throne in his turn. The detail from his captivity that sticks comes from more than one source. A bishop among them. Locked up, stripped of his power, his armies gone and his country in other hands, Vlad could not stop. He caught the mice that ran the floor of his cell. He caught the small birds that landed at his window, and he impaled them, or he cut them slowly into pieces on splinters of wood and bits of stick, building a tiny field of the dead on his windowsill, one mouse at a time. The man who had nested birds in the rib cages of 20,000 corpses spent his prison years pinning sparrows to slivers of wood because there was nothing larger left to kill. He did it for years. Whatever drove the stakes outside Targovishte was still running in him with no army, no enemy, no throne to justify it. Just a man alone in a room, working a mouse onto a splinter to watch it die. The strangeness of the imprisonment deepens the longer you look at it. Corvinus had locked Vlad up on the strength of forged letters and never really explained himself, and yet he didn't kill him, didn't even keep him in harsh conditions for the full stretch. Over the years, the prince was moved into better quarters, given more freedom, eventually allowed a wife from the king's own family. A man held on charges of treason to Christendom does not normally marry the king's cousin. What seems to have happened is that Corvinus came to understand he might one day need exactly what Vlad was. A commander who would do to the Ottomans the things no one else would do. And so he kept him alive and on the shelf, the way you keep a weapon you don't want to use but can't bring yourself to throw away. For more than 10 years, Vlad sat in that strange in-between state. A prisoner being slowly rehabilitated, a monster being kept in reserve, a deposed prince marrying into the family of the man who'd deposed him. And the whole time, by the accounts, he went on quietly impaling whatever small living things came within reach, keeping his hand in, waiting. He got out in 1475. The Ottomans were pressing hard against the region again, and Vlad's old and specific skills, his ferocity, his knowledge of the enemy, his willingness to do anything at all, were suddenly valuable again. His release was arranged in part at the urging of Stephen III of Moldavia, his cousin, a great and capable ruler in his own right, who needed every anti-Ottoman fighter he could lay hands on. Vlad fought for Corvinus's interests down in Bosnia in early 1476, and the old habits came back instantly, as though the decade in prison had simply paused them rather than ended them. He mass-impaled captured Turks there too, the prison years having changed nothing essential about who he was or how he made war. And then, in November of 1476, with Hungarian and Moldavian backing behind him, he retook the throne of Wallachia for the third time, his third reign. It lasted barely 2 months. The support that had carried him back evaporated almost the instant the crown was on his head. The boyars had not forgotten him any more than he had ever forgotten them, and the new generation feared and hated him just as the old one had. The Ottomans wanted him gone and would back anyone who'd remove him, and his foreign allies, Hungarian and Moldavian both, could not stand over him forever to prop him up. A man who rules entirely by fear has a problem the moment his ability to enforce that fear wavers even slightly, and Vlad's wavered fast. sometime before the 10th of January, 1477, so most likely in the final days of December 1476, Vlad was killed. In battle, in the marshy ground near Snagov or Bucharest, his small force overwhelmed and cut apart. The exact circumstances of his death are genuinely uncertain, and the surviving accounts disagree with one another in ways we simply cannot resolve at this distance. One version holds that a disguised Turkish assassin got to him in the confusion. Another, from the Russian source, says he was killed by his own men, that during the battle he climbed a hill to get a better view of the enemy being routed and driven back, and that his own soldiers, mistaking him for a Turk in the chaos and the press, struck him down before they realized who he was. And that second version carries a horrible plausibility, because Vlad had a well-documented habit of disguising himself in Ottoman dress to move through and around enemy lines, the very trick he'd used to take Giurgiu. The man who had weaponized a Turkish costume so brilliantly may, in the end, have been killed by his own side for wearing one at the wrong moment. We can't confirm it, but it fits him almost too well, a death shaped exactly like his life. What seems clear is that the end came fast and in confusion. Somewhere in the cold, marshy ground near the capital, a small force cut to pieces in winter, and that the man who had spent 20 years making sure everyone knew exactly how his enemies died, left behind no clear account of how he died himself. What the sources agree on is what was done with the body. The Ottomans hacked his corpse apart on the field. His head was sawn off the neck and packed into a jar of honey to stop it rotting on the long ride south through the summer, and carried all the way to Constantinople, to Mehmed. In the capital, it was lifted onto a stake and set up in the open in the middle of the city, the skin going dark and the features sinking into the honey slick of the cut, left where the whole population could file past and see for certain that the impaler was finally on a stake of his own. He'd spent 20 years raising people on sharpened wood for crowds to look at and fear. He finished as a head on a spike above a public square, in the great city of the empire he'd fought his whole life, the honey still bright around the cut of his neck. The 15th century built that ending without anyone having to write it. The name everyone knows him by, Tzepes, the Impaler, he never heard in his lifetime. It came later, attached to him posthumously, sometime around the middle of the next century, a Romanian rendering of the same idea the Ottomans had already named him with, the one who impales. In his own day, he was Vlad, son of Dracula, the dragon's son. The Turks gave him the impaling title first, out of the experience of fighting him, and the Romanians took it up afterward. So the two names that cling to him both came from other people's reactions to what he did. Dracula from the order his father joined, Tzepes from the method his enemies could not forget. He didn't choose either one. They were both, in a sense, given to him by the way the world received him, which is a strange thing to be able to say about a man's entire name. Where the rest of him went, no one really knows, and the mystery is its own strange little puzzle. The traditional story says he was buried at Snagov Monastery on its island out in the lake, where he had been a patron and a benefactor in life. For a long stretch of time that was simply accepted as fact, repeated without much question. But when an archaeologist named Dinu Rossetti excavated the supposed grave beneath the church floor in 1933, he found no human remains in it at all. just some animal bones scattered in the spot where the great prince was meant to lie. The tomb was empty of Vlad entirely. Some historians now think he may actually have been buried at a different monastery, Comana, which he himself had founded and which sat near the battlefield where he most likely fell. But the honest answer is that the burial place of one of the most famous and infamous men in all of European history is genuinely unknown. His head went to Constantinople on a spike, and the rest of him simply slipped out of the record and vanished, which, for a figure this notorious, is a strange and almost fitting disappearance. The man who left bodies everywhere left no body of his own that anyone can find. People have searched. The grave that was supposed to hold him held a few animal bones and a question, and the question is still open. His bloodline did not die with him, and the apple did not fall far from the tree. His son, by Justina, named Mircea, born around 1462, grew up and eventually became voivode of Wallachia himself. In 1508, more than 30 years after his father's death, history handed him the name Mircea cel Rău, Mircea the bad, the evil. And he earned it by trying, by every account we have, to rule exactly the way his father had, through terror, through mutilation, cutting off the noses and the lips of his enemies, reaching for the family's old methods. He went after the boyars who had grown powerful in the years since Vlad, confiscating their lands, executing the heads of the great families, mutilating others and driving them into exile, doing to the nobility of his own day what his father had done to the nobility of the generation before. It was almost as though the cruelty had been handed down like an inheritance, the son picking up the father's tools and finding they still fit his hands. He lasted about a year on the throne before the families he'd attacked combined against him and drove him out of it. He fled north into Transylvania, into the lands of the same Saxon towns the Draculae had spent decades terrorizing, and there, in 1510, he was assassinated. Stabbed to death on the steps outside the cathedral in Sibiu, run through by an enemy in the open, in daylight, in front of a church, in one of the very towns his father had impaled a whole region around half a century before. The man who killed him was said to have been settling a score of his own, and the killing was reportedly carried out with a kind of public satisfaction, the crowd of a town that had long memories watching a son of Vlad cut down on holy ground. The family's long, bloody relationship with those Saxon towns ended more or less the way it had largely been conducted throughout. In blood, with a blade, on the cathedral steps, the son finishing the story in a place that had every reason to remember the father, and apparently did. That leaves one last thread to pull, the one a lot of you came in expecting from the very start, and it turns out to be much, much thinner than the legend has always suggested. The vampire. The connection between the real, historical Vlad and Bram Stoker's fictional Count Dracula is almost entirely a matter of a borrowed name, and very little beyond that. When Stoker was writing his novel in the 1890s, working at his research, he was hunting for an exotic, frightening setting and an exotic, frightening name for his vampire count, who in the early drafts of the book wasn't even called Dracula at all. He was called Count Wampir, which is, let's be fair, about as subtle as a brick. Then Stoker came across the name Dracula in a book from 1820, William Wilkinson's account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, which carried a footnote mentioning that Dracula in the Wallachian language meant devil. Stoker liked the sound of it, liked the meaning. He crossed out Wampir in his notes and wrote in Dracula. And that, as far as the surviving record of his research actually shows, is very nearly the whole of the connection. His working notes contain almost nothing about the real Vlad III. No impalements, no forest of stakes, no Danube campaigns, no Wallachian politics. The vampire mythology that fills the novel comes from Eastern European folklore about the undead, the strigoi and creatures like them, not from the biography of a 15th century prince. Stoker took a name and a meaning and a vaguely menacing patch of geography. He did not, as far as anyone can tell from what he left behind, take the man himself. The now popular idea that the historical Vlad deeply and directly inspired the fictional Count, that the novel is somehow a coded retelling of the Impaler's real deeds, was largely constructed and popularized much later by two scholars, Raymond McNally and Radu Florescu, in a best-selling book in 1972. And it's a thesis that even they later softened and walked part-way back. It made for an irresistible story, of course. The real flesh and blood monster standing behind the fictional one, history more horrifying than horror. But the actual seam between them is mostly just the name and a footnote. The man who washed his hands in blood, by his enemy's account, and the Count who drinks it in Stoker's fiction, are connected by a single word borrowed from a single footnote and a writer's instinct for a good, dark name. They are separated by 400 years and very nearly everything else. The castle the tourists visit isn't his. The vampire isn't him. The name is the only real bridge, and even that started life as a knight's badge in Nuremberg, pinned to his father's chest by an emperor, generations before a novelist in England ever went looking for something frightening to call a count. All right, that's where I'll leave Vlad for today. Tap subscribe so the next deep dive actually finds its way to you, and leave me a comment telling me which moment was the one that made you put your drink down. The channel keeps running because of the people who chip in over on the membership, and if that's you, thank you truly. You're the reason these research-heavy ones get to exist at all. If it's not you, that's completely fine. Making it all the way to the end of a long one like this already helps more than the algorithm lets on. I've got another dark and strange corner of history half mapped and waiting, and I'd be glad to have you along when it goes up. Look after yourselves out there, and I'll catch you in the next one.